All right, welcome back to the My Sugar-Free Journey podcast. We have another return guest this week on the podcast, Mr. Ivor Cummins. So most of you probably don't remember when he was on the first time, because I think he was on like episode 3 or 4. 2 or 3 years ago when we first got started. The reason why I had him on there at that time was because I went through a little phase there for a little while because I was really fascinated with engineers who were entering into the medical space and doing things that the medical space either didn't seem to be willing to do or just did not have the skills or the tools in order to do, especially when it came to cholesterol. I found his video, The Cholesterol Conundrum, on YouTube, and I watched through it and just absolutely had to have him on the show. And he's done so many things since then. So Ivor, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Aaron. Great to be back.
Yes, absolutely. So, when I first had you on, you were part of like a little series where I had, it was I had Dave Feldman, I had a couple other people on there, and at the time like I said, I was really interested in what engineers were doing in this space, because it seemed like you guys were doing things that the medical establishment just couldn't. And since then, that's changed. So we're, another 3 years down the road, and we're seeing a lot more activity from doctors, from nutritionists, from people who are starting to get this as this movement is starting to spread and starting to grow. Let's get into a little bit about your background, what you're about, how you got here, and then why you think engineers they seem to be skilled for something that you wouldn't think an engineer would be skilled to do.
Right, Aaron. Well, my background is biochemical engineer, so I had that training in biochemistry, but I didn't use it much over my career, really, the biochemical stuff. But I was basically involved for 30 years nearly in complex problem solving. So leading teams of engineers in multifactorial problems, which can get really, really difficult because there's many factors and they're all interacting. And I spent the last 15 years in people management, managing teams of engineers. And I was still, when there was a major issue in my corporation, I would still drop out of my management role and lead the big teams when problems got really big or very expensive. So I think the reason engineers are good at this is because a large proportion of them, compared to the public, are skilled in the technical arts of problem solving, analytics, comparative analysis, and I could go on and on all these tools of logic and physics to get to the bottom of complicated multi-factor systems.
Yeah, absolutely. So what was the problem you were trying to solve there in the beginning? What started you on this path?
Well, my problem didn't appear to be a huge one at first. I got some standard blood tests. I had no particular issue, and I came back with 3 measures that were pretty high. And the doctor was very good, went through the measures. One was cholesterol, was a bit high, and I didn't know much about that, only that it was bad, right? And the other 2 were serum ferritin, which is a test for the iron loading in your blood, and gamma glutamyl transferase, GGT, and that's a liver enzyme. And the last 2, the ferritin and the GGT, were super high. So the population level, I was kind of twice the upper end. So I knew as an engineer looking at these, I didn't know exactly what they meant, but I thought, wow, that's special. That's a special cause. That's not just I'm on one end of the population. I knew instinctively that that's a big deal at some level. And because they were standard blood tests, it wasn't like she gave me or he gave me weird blood tests and they might not mean anything. There's a reason they do these blood tests, because they're important. So long story short, I couldn't get any answers from the doctor on what would cause these to go up. I got very weak answers, and I couldn't get an answer on how important they were. And I was kind of shocked because I thought the doctor would just say, okay, these are important. They mean this in the future, and here's the few causes that could drive them up in your life. Go off and fix these things. I got none of that. So I went to another doctor, more experienced, actually someone I know, and we went through it, and he didn't really know much more. And then I went to a very senior person, and I didn't get much more. So I knew there was something massively wrong. I had no question in my mind. So I began to research in the medical databases, because with a biochemical degree and 30 years of problem solving and data analysis and all the other tools, I knew I could go in there and find out the answers, and I did.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, we just had Petey Mangan on the show probably about 10 episodes ago, and we were talking about iron and what that did for you and why it was important to keep those certain levels at a certain level. So that was really interesting. Can you talk to us a little bit? So you're looking at these blood numbers. They're not quite right. You begin to realize that doctors maybe don't, really know what to do about it. Was there something that made you think, I mean, because I know in the past, before I started on this path, if a doctor said, "Oh, the number's high, but don't worry about it," I probably would have said, "Okay," and never thought about it again. What made you think, "Hey, I really need to track this down and figure this out"?
Right, yeah, it's a good question. Well, the reason was that I looked at them, and I'm so familiar with data from my work world and normal distributions, that when I saw my numbers, I immediately, even before we discussed them, I looked at the page and I saw the laboratory reference range. Like, let's say GGT was 18 to 50 is the normal range, and I was 110. And similarly with ferritin. So I knew immediately what we say in engineering is, if you're within the normal distribution, it can just be noise. But if you're way outside, there's a special cause at play. So I knew there was something special going on with me, and it wasn't good. The doctor did say that these things are not good when they're high, not much detail. So I knew not only are these standard blood tests, they're not good when they're high, but I'm way outside the distribution with a special cause. And I said, okay, that's very meaningful. That's a big deal. I just knew it was.
Right.
And it took me my first night researching ferritin and GGT in PubMed and ResearchGate. I had corporate logons for these databases. I had papers the first night telling me these were a big, big deal for mortality, disease. They were a huge deal. And then I went after them hardcore in the following few weeks.
So now you've got some information that says it's bad, but you don't have, unless you found it in these papers, you don't really have a path to get them back to normal. What was that like? How did you finally chart a path to get these levels back where they needed to be?
Well, what I did was, after a week or two of research, and again, a root cause problem solving expert doesn't just jump around and look at papers. You follow all the data you're getting to direct you to the next paper. So there's millions of papers, but you follow a beeline. And if you're skilled, it doesn't take long at all. It's quite shocking how quickly you can do it. So I, within a week or two, had found my way to the metabolic syndrome, or the insulin resistance syndrome, or hyperinsulinemic syndrome. And once I discovered that, I literally broke through into a world of cause and effect. And I grasped it very quickly. So I realized I had metabolic disease, and it was nothing to do with cholesterol.
Yeah, so this is very similar to my story in that, I had all these things wrong with me. It was obese, I had metabolic syndrome, I had I was sick, I had, asthma, all these things wrong with me. And then I remember how shocked I was when it finally dawned on me, oh, all this has the same root. It's all the same thing. It's insulin. And then I thought, this is something that really needs to get out there. This idea needs to get out there. So you figured out that the root of a lot of these things is insulin resistance. What took you from there to where you did that YouTube video, Cholesterol Conundrum? Because even that is a big jump.
Yeah, so that was a little later. The first lecture I gave to around 100 plus engineers in my corporation was called the metabolic syndrome. And I basically in an hour-long lecture, explained it all. And I explained everything, how sugar and refined carbohydrates were the big problem, not ancestral fatty foods. I explained the hormones insulin and leptin and ghrelin and glucagon. So I explained how all the processes worked in the body and how they could be thrown off track completely and what caused that and what didn't. So I went through basically everything. But I didn't go through cholesterol a lot, and I had begun to become fixated with cholesterol because we've heard for 40 or 50 years that that's the big deal, right?
Right. It's still the big boogeyman. Mm-hmm.
It's still the big boogeyman. And I had found out in the first few weeks that it was almost a distraction. I mean, some people with genetically high cholesterol can have issues, but the overwhelming majority of the cholesterol problem is really just a proxy for the insulin and hormonal problems and metabolic problems. So I knew this and I thought, I want to know all about cholesterol. So I began to deep dive in the following month or two on lipoproteins, the LDL, the HDL, you know, the chylomicrons, and I just became obsessed with that whole world. And after a couple of months, I had grasped and plotted and drawn out all of the pathways of importance in cholesterol metabolism. And I realized I got to do another lecture. I got to explain to people how we've been duped on cholesterol for 50 years. And I did. And that was the one you saw.
Yeah, I want to go over those numbers because, you know, I was just reading something just this morning while I was getting some things ready for this interview, and I was reminded of Tim Russert. You know, he was the NBC or the is it CBS? He was, you know, the guy on TV, whatever, and he had was taking statins and had a lot of his cholesterol numbers in a fairly decent range, except he had very high triglycerides, he had very low HDL, but his total cholesterol was okay. And so the metrics that his doctors were using, which is, I think, total cholesterol by something else, he looked okay. But when you look at his ratio of triglycerides to HDL, it was miserable. It was like a ratio of 4+, which is, you know, you're right in that range for sudden death. And his doctors missed it because they weren't even looking at that numbers. And those numbers seem to be, you know, there's a direct correlation between your triglyceride numbers and low HDL and sudden death, but that just didn't seem to be on anybody's radar at the time. So in your research, you're looking at this. When did you start to realize, oh my gosh, we've got this wrong, and these are deadly consequences for people. You know, that this is real world stuff, and we're not even looking at the right numbers. What was that like, and how are you figuring that out?
Yeah, that was what drove me a lot, as well as my technical interest, because once I get a problem, I've got to get to the bottom of it, regardless. But the other thing that drove me was I realized how enormous this misunderstanding was and the implications for people, like you say. So I learned about HDL and triglyceride ratio very early on because they're part of the metabolic syndrome. So before I even got deep into cholesterol. But then when I began to get into cholesterol, I realized to what extent the LDL is just totally misleading, and the total cholesterol, like you said. And I found paper after paper after paper all saying the same thing, including Framingham. So the massive Framingham study, run for 70 years now, I think, or 60 years, they discovered in the Framingham study that the triglyceride HDL ratio was the important one, or the total cholesterol divided by HDL. It was way, way more important than LDL. They knew that, but they never published it. They never really broadcast it. And the reason was that the LDL was the bad cholesterol. It was a simple concept. And as the years went by, you had drugs to lower the bad LDL, but none of the drugs for HDL worked. So the whole system of research and the business and the medical business just targeted and focused on LDL. But like you say, it's completely misleading. So I've one of my earliest studies showed that a very high triglyceride over HDL ratio was 16 times more likely to have a future heart attack than a low one. And studies of the same era showed that with LDL, it was maybe 1.4 times more, maybe. Yeah. So I just could, like you, I guess, I could not believe, because this would never happen in engineering. No way. In engineering, you must find the correct answers or your competitor will kill you.
Right.
So the whole evolution of corporations and engineering companies, they must get to the right answer quick and not be distracted or they'll be killed. But in medicine, it doesn't work like that.
Well, that's one of the more interesting things that we've seen over the last, 3, 4, 5 years is there does seem to be a competition now that there wasn't, 10 years ago, a competitive counterculture where you have more doctors, more nutritionists, and et cetera, who are figuring this out, that are helping their patients, see it this new way. And the resistance to this is at times it's really shocking. We've got some really smart, doctors and people that are, reversing diabetes, that are really doing some amazing things in the medical field, and they're getting called on the carpet. They're being threatened to, get their licenses taken away. I'm thinking here of Noakes and Fetke, and there are others. But it's shocking to see that there's not as much ammunition on our side of the argument to be able to push back and say, okay, you guys have got this wrong for years. What do you think there would need to be, for this side of the argument to have the power that it would need to really be able to push back against these institutions that are teaching different things?
Yeah, well, Aaron, I would say it needs a critical mass of medical professionals and research professionals to have the courage to speak this. Well, first they need to understand it, but then they need to speak out. And I think that's going to come. Like, it's small, it's huge compared to it was 10, 15 years ago, for sure, the amount of medicos we have and everyone else. But it's going to need to get to a bigger percentage of the overall medical establishment. So I think when you get up to 6, 7, 8, 9% of doctors in the system get this, we're going to head into a tipping point and things are going to get really interesting. But right now it's probably only 1 or 2% of a strong grasp of what we're talking about.
Yeah, because what needs to happen eventually is you've got to replace all the textbooks. You've got to these ideas have to be in the the medical schools, and you have to start having a new generation of doctors being trained this way. Because and I talk to a lot of doctors, and the one thing that I get from them is that transition to go away from what you were taught. You spent $100,000 on your training and spent 7 years learning all this stuff, and to go against that is, oh my gosh, it's really difficult. And it's a hard road to hoe.
It is, and yet on the positive side, and it's probably 3 or 4 or 500 grand, I think, if you in America especially, to get through medicine. Yeah, but I think the good thing is that you don't need to throw out everything you learned, because most of what you learned in medical school is broadly correct. Generally, most of the physiology, the pathology, most of the core knowledge, and certainly all of the drug knowledge, is not completely wrong. The big thing is you need to take away cholesterol as the center of chronic disease.
Right. And
you need to put in metabolic syndrome, hyperinsulinemia syndrome. And once you do that, you'll just have a new focus. The doctors will be spending all of their focus now on something new. It's not actually conflicting what they learned at all. It's just filling a gap. And when it fills the gap, it'll fill the gap so much, the other stuff will fall away. And that's kind of the way I view it. Because for me, when I learned this stuff, 40 years of brainwashing about cholesterol and fats just began to fall away. Mm-hmm. And I think that can happen. Now, the big problem is the resistance that you just mentioned. If there was no resistance and this was like engineering and new ideas began to grow and everyone just kind of looked over with some interest and began to look at them, it would happen fast.
Right.
It would yeah. But everyone in medical and nutrition professions has a huge amount of personal pride to lose. Even if you leave aside pharma losing revenue and food companies, you know, all these people who said a certain thing for 30 or 40 years now have to change it.
Right.
That's awkward.